Hello crew, welcome to the next installment of our bar build video. I hope you enjoy this, and if you wouldn't mind, please hit those like and subscribe buttons as always, and hit me up in the comments with any questions or issues. Enjoy. So if you look at the wall behind me, you see we have all the drywall demoed out, and it's down to the studs and the insulation. I'm not sure how much of that we actually caught on camera while we were doing our demo. We got to this point in our project when we started to work on this wall and take a look at where the framing was underneath, how the electric was run, all that stuff, and how we were going to incorporate this wall into our project. We realized we had a few problems, and we were going to have to take this drywall out, take it right down to the studs, and redo some framing and redo some electric. And I'll tell you why. This is going to be one of the focal points of the room that we're doing. In the center here is going to be a big screen TV. It's going to have a pretty robust sound system. It's going to have in-wall stereo components, including in-wall speakers for the surround sound, which also includes in-wall subwoofers. Those in-wall subwoofers have some pretty specific install specs. Included in those install specs are, for the most part, a cavity that is the dimensions of a 16-inch on-center framing. There's a little bit of leeway there, plus or minus, but for the most part it equates to 16 inches on center. So if the way this is 24 inches on center, there's no way we were going to be able to make that work. We knew we had to expose things and create that proper spec space with the wall cavity. Then when we got into the center, pretty much what's going to happen, at least as it stands right now, is our TV is going to be right in the center point right here. You can kind of see how we have these two sections. We have that 4-foot space on the left where I already started doing some demo. We have this 4-foot space in the middle, pretty much where our TV is going to go, and then that 4-foot space on the right. So in order to make everything be, for the most part, even, we're going to have to do 16 inches on center on this section on the left, do some demo over there, and do 16 inches on center for that section on the right. The middle, for the most part, can stay as is. But the problem that we ran into here, and this is one of the reasons that you always open up the wall when you're doing projects like this and you're going to do in-wall components and stuff, you need to look behind there and know what's going on. One of the issues we have here is we have this chimney clean out. Right now it's a gas fireplace, and that was all done during a prior remodel, so this clean out was never needed. And that was actually covered up by the old drywall. And I'll see if I can post a picture, link a picture in the video as we're talking here. But initially what I had planned on was I was just going to do these two sections on the left and the right, frame those the way I needed for the stereo components, and just leave this section alone and then drywall and tape it all together. But as I was kind of pawing around in the wall here, trying to trace studs with my stud finder, something just didn't seem right. And I said, you know what, for the 4-foot section, it's almost easier just to open it up anyway and retape all new drywall. So I opened it up. When I did that, I found this framed out box here that was around the fireplace clean out. And again, when I was kind of pawing around in the wall, I knew something just didn't seem right there, that there might be some more blocking or stuff in there. Now if I hadn't done that and just left that as is, once we finished the drywall and then I started drilling holes and stuff to put the speakers in, that would have created a serious problem and we would have to take a few steps back to fix that. So that's one of the reasons that whenever you're doing projects like this, just open up the entire wall and take a look at it. I knew I was probably going to have to do that anyway to redo some of the wiring. At the end, it's minimal work to just put new drywall over and tape it. In fact, in a lot of cases, it's easier because you can seam your drywall up the way it's meant to be and not have to worry about the butt joints. The other problem that we're going to have to contend with here is our electric. So if you look, our electric is running along these stud cavities here. That's going to interfere with those install specs of those install subs. So as we progress here, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to kill the electric. I'm going to disconnect that. Once we get some framing built back up into here, we'll redo that. I have to take some measurements and make sure that everything complies with code for our outlet spacing. But what I'm probably going to do for those outlets down there, both the cable and the electric, is I'm actually going to discontinue those altogether. I'm just going to loop this wire all around to our next outlet. And what I'll do is to kind of future-proof this, is I'll leave a wire, both a coax and a power cable, loose behind the wall, not hooked up to anything, and then I'll put the other ends somewhere else so they can be tied in later. The way this is envisioned right now is for this entire wall to be clean. To go ahead and have the TV off, we're going to have our speakers on each side, we're going to have those recessed subwoofers, and everything will be as symmetrical as we can get it. If we have an outlet that's in place down there before we actually assemble everything and get the TV mounted and get our speakers in, there's the potential that that's going to be off-center and it's just going to make everything look kind of cockeyed and haywire. We don't necessarily want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to discontinue those outlets. I'll leave a freestanding wire and a freestanding cable behind the wall, and we'll terminate them somewhere else, not hooked up to anything, so that they can't become energized. So this way, if in the future we need to put an outlet in there, we can go ahead and do a new work box, just drill our hole, put the outlet in there, fish through the cable, and then connect that at its other termination point, and we'll be good to go. We're here, we have the spot with our bare concrete wall. You can see we already did some demo work that was off camera on this. We took out the insulation, I cut out the framing. We still have some blocking that you can see up here. We'll go ahead and we'll reuse that when we reframe for 16 inches on center. But my issue that I have right now, before we actually get into the reframing and working on this electric work, is this bare concrete wall. If there wasn't anything else going in there, it really wouldn't be an issue. We wouldn't have to talk about this further. We could just frame, I could put some batt insulation there, we'd vapor barrier over it, it would be fine. But specifically in the center cavity right here, we're going to have an in-wall subwoofer system that's pretty robust and goes up the entire cavity of the stud for the most part. So I'm not too keen on just putting that in there and not having any insulation behind that. My other worry is that with the concrete, that has the potential to leak water in. Concrete can actually act like a sponge if there's drainage issues or significant water on one side of it. If there's a heavy rainfall, or for whatever reason over the years the gutters have clogged and failed, whatever may happen where there's significant water behind the foundation wall, the concrete can actually absorb that water, and if it keeps absorbing enough of it, that will eventually seep out the other side onto the inside. It is less of an issue with a poured foundation wall versus block, but it does still happen. And my concern is that there's the potential for that to happen, and now we have an expensive in-wall subwoofer system all the way behind the stud cavity. Plus, the subwoofer is filling that cavity, so we have no way of insulating that. My fix for that is to install some XPS, or extruded polystyrene foam insulation, directly onto the concrete wall. That's going to do a couple things. It is going to increase my insulation value a little bit. They come in 4x8 sheets, so we'll do this entire 4x8 cavity, even though I really only need it behind the 16 inches. It's just going to give me a little bit of better insulation all around, so I'm just going to throw the entire sheet in. So in addition to giving me insulation behind that in-wall subwoofer system, we're going to have some surround speakers on each side here, and we're going to have to pull out some of that insulation to get those speakers in. Not a lot, but enough that it might reduce a little bit of our insulation value. So just having a little bit extra there is only going to increase the insulation capability. The other thing that's nice about the XPS, and why I really want to make sure I use it behind that subwoofer system, is that it's waterproof and it's watertight. So we're going to get that up on the wall. We'll go ahead and we'll use a special foam board glue. We'll glue it in. The foam board won't have quite as much insulation properties as either these fiberglass batts or the new stuff we're going to use is called mineral wool, and we'll get into that. But it does give us a little bit of insulation value. The other thing it's going to do is it's going to help protect us in case there's any water seepage from the concrete. You never want to enclose off the entire space with it and make it vapor tight unless that's your only form of insulation. If you look here, we have a vapor barrier, and we're going to redo that and complete this vapor barrier. So if we have the vapor barrier on one side and then another vapor barrier on the other, and air does get in there, it's just going to create a haven for moisture, and this insulation will act as a sponge and just start to suck it up. So we traced the circuit breaker that powers these wires here, and we shut it off. You saw me cut the wire. Once I cut the wire, I want to figure out which side of the circuit is feeding the power and which side is receiving the power coming through, because that's going to help me trace my wires, fish my new wire through, and just get a general plan for where I want to run from which receptacle to which receptacle. So to do that, I use my non-contact tester, and I ran into a little bit of an odd situation. Normally when this will happen, when you cut the wire, the one that is feeding the receptacles downstream will be hot. The wires that's receiving that feeding power will not be hot. But when I threw my tester on it, both of them were hot. A little bit confusing because that's generally not supposed to be like that. The first thing I thought was maybe this wire doesn't go to that receptacle. Again, logic would dictate that these kind of all go around in a loop. But I thought, you know what, that goes behind the wall. I really can't see it. Let me get a closer look and see if I can find out where it goes. I drilled an inspection hole in the wall, took a closer look inside the wall, and what I initially thought was correct. This wire goes into that outlet. So I did a pretty fair amount of wire tracing on both sides of the circuit, and actually traced these around to a junction box. And it's kind of a strange thing. For whatever reason, whenever the electrician wired this, when they remodeled the basement, the feeder wire goes into the junction box. One side goes around this way, the other side goes around this way, and all the hots are connected. That's usually not what you see. It's not going to hurt anything as long as those are on the same phase in the circuit. As long as they're on the same breaker, you're not going to trip anything. But again, it's just really not the preferred wiring practice. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to disconnect that box there. That box there will then become what's called an end run, and we will do the same thing with that. We'll take out that feeder wire, that box will become an end run, and we'll be good to move forward. So just going to throw out the safety disclaimer here. If you're not a qualified and licensed electrician and you are not comfortable with electricity, don't touch it. Call someone who is. Be safe. So I generally hate these backstab connections. I'll do a video on it at some point. If it's done by the time you're watching this, I'll make sure to link it in the video. So I'm going to go ahead. This is an old outlet anyway. I'm going to get a tamper resistant one. I got my loops in there, and we'll just use the screw terminals on the side. Much safer way to do it. Whenever I'm working with a receptacle and I have it taken apart, there's two things that will always make me change it. First is if it has those backstabs that I showed you earlier, and I will always go ahead and cut those out. There's little releases in here that you can use to release that. Generally for me it's easier to sacrifice the 1/4 inch of wire and just clip it out. There's usually enough like there is here. So if it's backstabbed, I'll replace it. And if it's not a tamper resistant outlet, I'll replace it. So if you look on the newer style outlets, and these are required by code, they have two little trap doors, one on each side. Both of these have to be engaged by the prongs on a plug in order to fully seat it in there. So even if you don't have a child in the house, there's always the possibility somewhere down the road that a child could come by and stick something in there, you know, whether it be a visitor, whether you sell the house a couple years down the road. So it's just a quick, cheap safety feature that I can add. So whenever I have an outlet pulled out, if it's not tamper resistant or if it's backstabbed, I'll replace it with a new tamper resistant receptacle. And I will always use these screw terminals, not the backstabs. Alright, we lightly tap that up in here to secure for the time being. Checks out good. Problem solved. Onto our insulation and framing. We're at the point where we're going to go ahead and put our foam board insulation up onto the concrete wall here. These come pre-scored. They have spots for 16 and 24 inches. So just going to take our center here. It's real easy. Just put your hand on the score mark, fold, and snap. I've already gone ahead and measured what our height is going to be, where new framing is going to go, and I cut a mark on that. So same thing, just score and snap. Now I'm going to go ahead and dry fit these pieces in. They're going to fit them where you want them, and I'm just going to hold it about an inch off the floor. I already went ahead and measured what our height is going to be on this, and I just cut a line with my utility knife just to score it. So same thing, we're just going to hold our foam board, snap, and that comes right off. And then we can just dry fit these pieces up into the wall, make sure they're going to fit the way we want them, and then we'll glue them in. To secure these from the wall, we're going to use this Loctite special foam board caulk, and it's made specifically for foam board. A lot of times people will just use construction adhesive, but depending on the makeup of your construction adhesive, that can actually eat away at your foam board and make this end up not sealing because it ate away at the XPS panel. So I always just use this stuff that's made for the foam board. You don't have to be too scientific with it. Open up your tube. That's fantastic. Nasty. Apparently this tube has sat a while, so shake up here too before you use it. Alright, you don't have to get too artistic with this. Just enough for a zigzag bead. You want this thick enough so that it settles in and actually makes contact with the concrete as we put it on. I opened up my tube a little bit. We'll see if that flows a little better. You want to have that nice thick bead, because as you push this into the concrete, it's going to settle out and flatten out a little bit. So you want to make sure that there's enough of a bead on that to let it maintain contact with the concrete and the foam board. It's probably a little excessive, but that tube is just about done, and I don't think we're going to get much more out of it. So why not use it? Now we're just going to go ahead and use some foil tape to tape our seam down the middle here. Doesn't have to be anything crazy expensive, not that $15 roll stuff. Just a standard foil reflective tape will do just fine. I like to center it on the top, and then center it on the seam as I go down, and just press on. And that way, if I start to get off center, it lets me make incremental corrections as I go. Just like putting our caulk on, doesn't have to be perfect. Just enough for a good seal and good adhesion. I have some blocking in front of me right now that I'm going to put together. We're going to tack that into the framing behind me, and then that's going to help create that base for those 16-inch on-center studs we need to do for the in-wall subwoofer system. Before I get into that, I just want to touch base on the foam board insulation. I can already feel the haters in their comments going on the comment section right now about, oh, you put foam board insulation in, you're going to do a vapor barrier, you're going to sandwich all the vapor in between, and you're going to create mold. That's not the case. That's not what's going to happen. I'll get further into that when we actually get to the drywall step and I do a vapor barrier over the framing and over the studs. But that's not the case. We're going to have enough airflow in there, and I'm not going to completely seal it off. The only stud cavity I'm going to completely seal off is the one that has that in-wall subwoofer. And that's going to have some heat generated inside of it, so I want to make sure that there's insulation on the back of that, because that will actually condense on that concrete wall. When it comes to setting up our layout here, it's going to be very similar to how we're marking out our normal wall. We're framing 16 inches on center with just a little minor variance. So I'm going to bring my tape measure out along here. But remember, we already have a stud on this side that we're framing into. So the normal thickness of a stud is 1.5 inches. That's your normal thickness of a 2x4. So if we're going on center of that, half of that would be 3/4 inch. So we just need to offset by 3/4 inch to take account for the studs that are already on the edges here. So, like I said, I'm going to do this like normal. I'm going to bring my tape measure out on top, but instead of normally making my mark at 16 inches, remember I'm offset by 3/4 inch, so I'm just going to bring that back 3/4 inch to 15 1/4. We're going to do the same thing over here. Instead of doing 32, we're going to do 31 1/4. And then that will account for our distance between studs. And now we're on the bottom plate of our wall here, so we're going to do the same thing. Remember, if we were right in the center of the stud here, we'd be 16 inches on center. But because we're offset a little bit, just by 3/4 inch, we're just going to move our tape back. So instead of at 16, we go 15 1/4. 31 1/4. Because we're toenailing these in, I'm just going to go one step further here, and I'm just going to mark the left and right stop points of my stud. That way when we toenail these in, I can know exactly where my stop point is. So to do that, it's the same concept with the 3/4 of an inch. I'm just going to go to my mark, I'm going to go 3/4 left, 3/4 right, and put marks, and that will let us know where to start and stop the stud. I'll show you a little trick here. Because we're going to be toenailing in, when you actually go through and do your toenails with the air nailer, the stud has a tendency to go left or right. Not by much, usually just by 1/4 of an inch, but it's enough just to make it annoying and take it off center. So what I always do is I just go for either edge, left or right. Just throw a screw in there, kind of at an angle for a stopping point. And now when we go to toenail in, we'll line our studs up on the side of that screw, nail in from one side, back out the screw, nail in from the other, going to be good to go. I make my measurements on my top plate for where I'm going to nail in my studs. We always want to go through and nail through the top plate instead of toenailing if we can. It is just a little bit stronger and the margin for error is a little bit reduced. So I'm going to nail through the top plate for the top of the studs because I can, and then in the bottom we're going to toenail those. So we have to set our boards up for that 16 inch on center for the studs. Now it's important to remember I'm actually going to be reversing my measurements because my crowns are up. I don't know if we got to this point in the video yet or not. I'll see how the editing goes. But whenever I'm framing a wall, you mark the crowns or the bow in the board. And I always put those up. And there's 3 reasons why I always put the crown up. 1, I do it the same every time, so I always know whenever I'm mid-process of a wall, I know my crowns are up. I do that so when I frame it with the crowns up, if I'm pushing a wall into place, I can pop it down and just push it up and nail it in when I'm doing my bigger framing projects. And the other reason is you have that bow in the board. If you put the crown up, well, now the board's not rocking on the ground. You have solid contacts on the end. So because I'm doing it like that, you have to remember this is going to be reversed. So when I'm making my measurements for my 16 inch on center, I'm going to be going off of this side. I can tell you right now just by looking at it, and you can probably see in the camera behind me, this 4x8 cavity is not square. That top right side is actually pushed in about an inch. So if I start my measurements from the bottom left-hand corner down there, and I do my other measurements from the top right, the whole thing is going to be cockeyed. So I want to make sure we're 16 inches on center from this point over, both on the top and the bottom. So when I do that, I actually have to start my measurements on this side because the crowns are facing up, so when we lift the wall up and turn it around, it's going to be in that top left-hand corner, and everything is coming off of that left side of the wall. We're here, we're going to start marking out our boards, crown up on the stud, crown up on the stud, crown up on our top plate. And we're going to do this like we normally would any sort of wall that we're measuring out for framing. The kicker is, remember we already have our left and right stud that should be on center. So instead of marking it at 16, well, we already have 3/4 of an inch of space on this side and 3/4 on this side of occupied stud space. It's because your normal stud width is 1.5 inches for a 2x4, so we have to kind of account for that. So normally what we do when we're framing is just go to 16 for 16 on center and put our mark there. Well, again, we already have a stud on the left, so we have to account for that. So we're just going to backtrack 3/4 of an inch and mark it 15 1/4 to occupy that, to make up for the stud space that's already here. Same thing when we go for our next one. Instead of going right at 32, we're just going to mark it 31 1/4 because everything is offset. Now you see, first try, no adjustments needed. A little bit of tweaking getting the boards in there, but measure it out the right way, should be perfect and plumb on the first try. And if it's not, redo it. Remember earlier we put the screws in on this side, now when I go to toenail, it's going to go right up against that screw, and that should hold it in place. Now up top here, I already threw nails into our blocking right here. Let's go ahead and get some shims in here. Shim nice and tight. Fire a few nails in there. So I want to give you an idea of what's going on here. You can see just because our wall is bowed right here and I have the insulation up, it's a little bit in front of this framing, I'm not getting a total flush edge right here. So that's causing a problem because when I go to drywall, this is going to stick out and the wall is going to look a little bent. What we're going to do is going to throw a screw in here. And this works for a concept like this or any other time that you run into this. Throw the screw in. Put the mark there. Take my hammer and pry in. And that kind of pushes it back. That compresses this foam just a little bit. And this lets me get this nice and flush with here. And then my wall is going to be nice and straight. Throw a couple nails in to hold that. We're all set. We'll repeat that for the other side. As you can see, it's even more pronounced here because we have that bow. This is where having a hammer handy really comes into play. Even though with the advent of framing nailers, it takes a lot of the hammering out of it, hammer is still a really good tool to have. Alright crew, thank you for watching that one. I'll link the next video in the series up top once we get it done. Friendly reminder, hit those like and subscribe buttons, and see you next time. Bye.